there is also this undocumented closet that undocumented individuals and students, are in. And again, this is not necessarily good or bad. It just is. And so I'll have a couple of students who tell me that they're undocumented. But I think most of them don't come out to me, and that's okay. One of the things that I talk about in my workshop is do not expect your undocumented students or anyone, whether they're foster youth or whether there's someone who has mental health disorders, to come out to you, because not everyone will come out. And it actually has nothing to do with you, because some professors and counselors take it personal, like, why don't they come out? They can trust me. It's not about you. And it's like, sometimes they don't trust the setting. Sometimes they don't trust their classmates. Sometimes they don't trust, like they've had really negative past experiences. I've had students that I've interviewed who are like, yeah, coming out was not easy. Then they started joking. My own friends started making fun of me and making comments that made me feel insecure. So I tell, and I preach this in my classrooms. I'm like, you don't have to tell me anything. Like, I'm going to be here for you, right? Like, you tell me what you feel comfortable with.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? I'm your host, Kevin Munoz. You're listening to the Leo podcast, where we talk about various educational topics, especially those impacting the Latin American community. This is today's free episode. If you want early access to episodes and bonus episodes, you can find that right now on our patreon.com/latinamericaneo. And if not, then enjoy this one. In today's episode, I had the pleasure to speak with Professor Esther Villegas-Sandoval, a sociology professor at the College of the Sequoia. She received her bachelor's and master's degree from California State University, Northridge, where she focused her studies on the experiences of undocumented college students in Southern California. Her areas of research and expertise include experiences and identity management of undocumented students, trauma-informed practices, and critical theory of love. Professor Villegas-Sandoval strives to foster equity, agency, and well-being. A large part of our conversation focuses on trauma's impact on many young immigrants and how the environment plays a role. So let's just get right into it, and I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did.
So hi, everyone. It's Esther Villegas-Sandoval. I'm actually a sociology professor and a researcher out in California. I've been teaching at the community college level for, I think it's 10 years, actually. And my research has primarily focused on the experiences of undocumented college students. And then from there, I've kind of gone down this path of learning to be trauma-informed and cultivating love. And the reason why I fell down this path is because one of the themes that kept constantly coming up in my work with undocumented students and research is that there's a lot of trauma and stress in the experiences. There's also a lot of joy, right? So like these things can coexist. So then I became really passionate about like, how do we foster joy in classrooms so that students can thrive? And how do we approach people so that they can reach academic goals, experience well-being, and we can foster all that. So now I'm a professor. I'm also a speaker, a public speaker. My research allows me to be hired, and I do trainings and workshops, professional development to aid teams in their knowledge.
How did you decide to pursue your bachelor's degree and then eventually get your master's degree at California State University in Northridge, right?
Yes.
And you touched on a little bit, but what made you like concentrate on undocumented people, specifically in the Southern California area, correct?
Yeah, so it's so funny because it was actually a psychology major.
Okay.
I went in like, I'm going to help people. I'm going to be a psychologist. Because, I don't know how many of you or your followers can identify with this, but so often, we're told like, go to college, but no one tells you what to study, right? No one tells you like,
I can definitely relate to that.
Right?
Yeah.
Like te regañan, right? They yell at you, they scold you. Everyone's like, do this, but like, no one tells you what to do. So I kept hearing, you go to college, but I was like, what majors? I want to help people. So I guess I'll do psych. I took a psych class, didn't like it. I got a C. I was butthurt. And I
C's get
actually,
degrees.
right. Yeah, I know, but I was not happy with that because I'm not a C student. Although there's nothing wrong if you are, your grades don't define you, and things happen. But I ended up taking the sociology class, and I remember just being so blown away. One of the things that had me to sociology, I'll be very honest with you, is actually learning about domestic violence. There was a lot of domestic violence in my household. It was something that made me feel really alone, very ashamed. I didn't know how to process it because we don't talk about domestic violence for the most part, right?
Right.
And when I would see my friends, yeah, maybe there was conflict in families, but there wasn't that excessive domestic violence that I had in my home. So I remember feeling really ashamed, very isolated. And I took a sociology class, and they talked about the difference between common couple violence and intimate terrorism, which are still part of domestic violence, but they're entirely different beasts. And I remember thinking, like, this is what I've been going through, right? Like, this has been my life. I can understand why my mom never, fought off my dad. I can understand why my mom stayed in the relationship. So it made me not feel alone. It made me finally understand my mom, because I think I was really confused and really hurt. And it really allowed for a lot of healing. And I really do believe that, like, for some people, in some ways, education can be part of our healing process. So that's how I fell into sociology. And then I love the discipline because it's all about understanding people, but understanding the societal factors. And to this day, like, I ride or die sociology all day, every day, right? Like, the world is symbolic. We give meanings to things. There's intersections of power. So I die for sociology. Like, I rep it hardcore.
I just imagine having like a hardcore, like, I die for sociology tattoo. Like,
right. It's so funny you say that because I have been thinking of that. And the closest I've gotten to a science tattoo is this one. It's like a little atom bomb.
I love it. That's awesome.
Yeah. So, but I've been thinking, I'm like, dang, what kind of social tattoo can I get? But yeah, it's awesome. And then I went into my master's. I didn't think I was going to get a master's, to be honest with you. Again, you don't know what to study, right?
Right. Yeah. I was going to say, did you just go into your master's right after your bachelor's, or was there like some break in between there?
No, right away. I remember having this professor who, to this day, I like love, like, in terms of, I feel like, an attachment. I remember him calling me into his office hours to help me with a research paper I had. And it's so interesting because, he saw things in me that I didn't even see in myself. And I remember him telling me, like, you're so smart, you need to get your master's. And I was like, I can do that. And, like, I didn't know anything. And so I applied, and I had a really high GPA. I had something ridiculous, like a 3.9. So I had great letters of recommendations, and, I got in without a problem. And then sociology just helps me understand the world. It helps me stay grounded. I'm disappointed in people, but I understand them at least, right?
That's a kind of like the double-edged sword also of like learning more about the world and how it works. It's just like, wow, this is so interesting, but it's just like, wow, there's so much like hate and like negative, but like you said, there's also so much like great things about it too. But it's just so much information on both ends to consume.
Yeah, like, and sometimes it's even harder because, like, you want to get all wrapped up in your feelings, but then you're like, well, let me think critically. And thinking critically means that you kind of have to keep your feelings in check, right? You have to be like, oh, I can't get all passionate about this because I have to think about it. And yeah, I got my master's. I remember thinking, like, I hate tests, so I don't want to do. I'm going to be real. I get hardcore, like, exam anxiety.
Yeah, so you got a 3.9 GPA over there.
I don't know how.
Overcame that.
Right? And but I still have it and I hate it. So I was like, I'll write a thesis. And I remember thinking, like, what do I want to write about? And at the time that I started writing and researching, there wasn't as much scholarly work around the topic. There was actually very little to no scholarly work around the experiences of undocumented kids. Everyone's looking at their parents, right? but no one is thinking like what happens to these children who are brought over as youth or as teens or as older teens, right? Or as babies. No one's asking about how they're doing. And so I really started finding researchers, emailing them like, hey, can I have access to your research studies? And sure enough, they would say like, hey, this hasn't been printed yet, but here you go.
Wow.
And yes, and so now it's entirely different, right? Like now there's a lot of scholarly awareness and a lot of research interest. But when I started, it wasn't there. And I just remember, um, I think that there's so many populations that we misunderstand, like women who have abortions, survivors of domestic violence, people who stay in domestic violence. I think there's a lot of stigma around groups. And I've always been really passionate about like, let's bridge and let's create understanding.
Mm.
And then, of course, I have family that's undocumented. And then in general, I just care about people and I care about human suffering. And I would like there to be a world where there's no human suffering eventually.
Yeah.
And so I just really fell into that. And, I don't know, that's how I went in. I
Right, right.
just fell
You
in
just
love with it.
decided
And
like that's the way that you want to go, and that's how you want to impact this world, right? That's amazing because like even you asking people for their research and even if it hasn't been out, that's just like such a risk to take because people say no and everything, and then even then like your passion drove you to just go dig for that information, and that's not easy to do. So I wanted to also focus on, this whole interview came about with the video that I stitched on Instagram and TikTok with the kids hearing how kids like how in our household we're so used to hearing our parents argue. Like unfortunately this is just something that we are used to, is hearing like our parents argue back and forth. And even in your own experience and as well as in my own experience, we just kind of sit there and absorb that, maybe without even knowing that we're like disassociating from that situation, right? And I just wanted to get your point of view on that as well. I thought it was really interesting, and I'd love to hear more about like what the impact of that is um, for like undocumented kids and Hispanics and Latinos in general, and since it's such like a cultural thing.
there's a lot to unpack in that. And
Yeah.
so I'm going to provide an answer, but there's a lot to say there.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, let's take it
Um,
bits by bits.
you're right. So first of all, one of the things that really bothers me is when people like say things like, like I see these videos sometimes on Instagram and people will say things like, oh, we're just built different. Like we know how to
Yeah.
take it. Like, first of all, first, we don't choose to disassociate, right? That is something that subconsciously happens for the brain to keep us as safe as we can. So it's not like there's these buttons that we have, and I'm going to be like, oops, boink, let me activate this, right? It is fundamentally a coping mechanism, right? Um, so for some people, when they experience, so let's take it back.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about trauma, we're talking about things that overwhelm our ability to function. And so they often come from events, set of circumstances, or conditions that created these impairing responses. So trauma is not the event or the condition itself. It's
Okay.
the impact and it's the lasting impact that it has on the body. Okay. Now, not all stress becomes trauma. And some
Mm.
stress is rather healthy for us. But if you're constantly stressed out and your cortisol levels are constantly high, then that's when it's problematic. So not all stress becomes trauma and not all trauma becomes PTSD. If
Okay.
something stressful impacts your ability to function and jeopardize your well-being, your feelings of safety, then that's trauma, right?
Mm-hmm.
If the trauma symptoms, meaning, so let me ask you this, Kevin. Have you ever gotten into a car accident?
Yes, I have.
Okay. So after you experience a car accident, sometimes you start feeling a certain ways when you're driving,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Like what?
Um, so I'm more careful with taking turns, but I will say I don't think it impacted me as much because it wasn't like a big car crash. But I will say this: my sister got in a really bad car accident, where like her car was totaled and everything. And this didn't happen too long ago, but she was driving and I was in the passenger seat, and it was really windy outside, and this like the sensation of the wind like against the car made her have like a panic attack. So she had to pull over, and I drove the rest of the way. Um, and that's from like the car accident.
Our car
Like she
accident.
said, like she had a bunch of memories just flash back to her. When and that's what gave her like that.
So that's trauma, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's impairing her ability to function. In this case, it's impairing her ability to drive, right? Or continue driving.
Yeah.
And so stimuli, in this case, wind, is triggering that flashback, which is very common. So when we experience things that are traumatic, oftentimes it's very hard for us to remember clearly or talk about what happened because we do not tend to retain, keep, or access explicit memory. So it's really hard for us to talk about sometimes what we went through, but your body will remember, right? You'll have
Mm.
flashbacks and you'll have nightmares. So those are the type of memories that we tend to have. Um, so let's say your sister's symptoms don't go away, then that's PTSD.
Mm.
If those symptoms persist, typically for 6 months and on, then that's PTSD, right? Because the time has passed on, but she's still engaging in avoidance. She's still getting maybe sweaty, right? When the wind comes, she's still having flashbacks, she's still having nightmares,
Mm.
etc. So trauma will lead to certain somatic experiences for the body to experience certain things like headaches and all kinds of stuff, right?
Yeah.
So I wanted to clear that off the way. Trauma impacts the body and the brain in so many ways. It impacts learning. It can make people hyper alert. So some people who have experienced a lot of trauma, it's really hard for them to sit down and focus because they're constantly scanning the environment because their
I'm like that.
brain has what happened?
I said I'm like that. So,
Those
that's
are
yeah. From like coming over here, from like crossing the border and everything. I was now like I scan like everything. And, I'm always scanning the rooms. And I never like realized why I did that so much. I'm always like very present, aware of my surroundings because of my experience of my passage to the United States.
yeah, so those are hyper alert traits,
Yeah.
right? And so some people can be hyper alert, other people can be hyper aroused. So they they react to what other people would call non-threatening cues. So like for a so like a kid who grew up in domestic violence, maybe a door closes and they flinch.
Mm.
You and I would perceive that as a non-threatening cue, right? It's the door closing. But for them, it's going to trigger like the wind. The wind for most people is a non-threatening cue, right? But for your
Yeah.
sister, it's triggering.
Right.
So there's that. Going back to this whole stage, um, I don't think sometimes people realize. So let me backtrack. One of the things that also bothers me is when people are like, oh, like, your trauma made you strong. I don't want to discredit that because in some ways, trauma survivors, we have so much resiliency and we show so much resiliency. Like Kevin, look at, you've been through a lot. Here
Mm.
you are providing for your family. Not only are you providing for your family, but you're providing for the community. You provide for free a service. If that is not a prime example of resiliency, I don't know what is, right? Like here you are that you're committed to your loved ones, you're committed to your family, you're committed to educating the community, like la raza, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't want to minimize that, but I think sometimes what people overlook is that, like, yes, trauma leads to maybe us being what strong, quote unquote, right? But in so many ways, trauma also impacts how we function. Like disassociation is not necessarily a good thing because in our relationships, in our classrooms, in our lives, we need to be present. So if you're shutting down, think about what you could potentially be missing out on. And the one thing that
Mm.
I always think about too is like, you know, I disassociate too, Kevin. I'm going to be straight up with you. Disassociation is my go-to. Whenever I start feeling really stressed out, I zone out. And people who I've worked with have told me this. Like if I'm in a really stressful meeting, I'm like, Esther is blah, blah. Like I'm present physically, but Esther has left.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot of, it takes a lot for me to be present. And you know, in my relationship now with my fiance, you know, he brought it up to me one time and we were having an argument. And a lot of the times I get really overwhelmed with arguments, even if we're not fighting, because it's triggering for me, right? And I'll disassociate, like, I can't do this. I start zoning out. Like he's talking, I'm not even listening to him. And he made a comment that he's like, how can we fix things if you're not really present? And that's true, right?
Yeah.
How can I begin to understand if I'm not even capable of listening? So, you know, when people say like disassociation, like, oh, this is great. I mean, it's functional. We needed to disassociate so that we could preserve our sense of safety. But as we get older, disassociation doesn't work for us anymore, right?
Yeah, you got to be present, like you said.
Yeah, or like, I mean, and I think people forget that it's just because something served a purpose for us in our childhood doesn't mean that we should carry over that behavior into adulthood. Like, thank God we had that back in the day, but we're not here anymore.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that just brings about to just like, when I posted on TikTok, I got a lot of comments on the TikTok one that it's just like, oh, this is just part of the culture. Like, this is what makes us stronger. This is like, I'm glad like that happened to me. Like, this isn't a real problem. And it's just like a lot of that, what you said too, that just like, that's toxic thinking in my opinion. Like, yeah, it would, maybe it did make you stronger, but you know, personally, like, there's other ways to be strong that doesn't have to be like traumatic for a kid.
Right.
Like, yeah, like why does this have to be like the way of our people to grow up and be strong, right? Like, it's just
and you know, I kind of I kind of push back on this whole idea of like it's part of our culture. I think it's part of people who had a culture of violence in their family.
Yeah.
Right. And the thing is that not all Latinos have a culture of violence in their family. And when we say like our culture, that's a way to homogenize and make something very like black and white. But the reality is that not all Latino households are unhealthy. Not all Latino households have domestic violence, right?
Right.
So I think it's one of the things for us to think about. Now, you know, I don't want to minimize people's experience because, and maybe some people feel that way. Maybe some people feel this like, oh, I feel proud. And you know what? You're allowed to feel the way that you want to feel. Yeah. But think about the ways in which maybe for other people this has been disruptive, right? Like maybe for them, they don't feel that way. Mm-hmm. For me personally, I feel like I feel both ways about the trauma that I've been through. I feel like in some ways it's like I really do fundamentally think that my trauma shaped who I am, and I know this like intuitively and also like like educational wise, right? Like the reading is all there. And I do feel like, you know, I'm not, I don't want to minimize that, but at the same time, do I wish that I didn't go through that? Yeah, of course. Right. Like my trauma had really hard, like it presented me with really hard challenges. Like it would have been nice to not have that.
I think back to a lot too. Like it shaped who I am and I'm stronger on certain aspects of it, you know, because of it. But would I want someone else, like my kid, to go through that? Like, no, I wouldn't. Like, I'd rather like go, like if I had a kid and like show him a different level of affection and try to stay away as much as you can. Right. I feel like sometimes it's just like, if you're having an argument, like let it be like a healthy argument, right? Like with your loved one. And I don't know how to define a healthy argument versus like a non-healthy argument. Like, but another thing that I wanted to touch up on and was in one of those articles that you were kind enough to share with me was how it the environment like affects also our ability, right, to think, and how it impacts our trauma, that we end up like adapting to our environment around us. And that's when I think this association, I guess, becomes like a thing, is that when we adapt to that type of environment. How do you think that like affects us later in life, when we're adapting to environments that are maybe not so healthy?
Disassociating is a way of adapting to the environment, right?
Okay.
So
Yeah.
here you are as a kid, and there's constant chaos, right? Maybe verbal abuse, maybe physical abuse,
Yeah.
maybe psychological abuse. Which, by the way, psychological abuse is abuse that hurts your sense of self and your sense of security, right?
Mm-hmm.
So threats are emotional abuse. No one actually has to touch you. It's still abuse because it's impacting how safe you feel. So stalking is a type of abuse.
Mm-hmm.
Even if that stalker never touches you, stalking itself is scary, right?
Yeah.
Because this person is always there. So disassociation is adapting to the environment. You can't change. The brain knows you can't change the environment. You're in this environment,
Okay.
and the brain's like, you know what? We're gonna check out so that you can maintain a sense of safety and you can maintain a sense of attachment to your caregiver. So we're going to shut you down, right? So that these things are not compromised. And again, I think it's functional in the moment because it keeps us relatively safe, right? It prevents us from being overwhelmed, right? So we kind of shut down. We're not necessarily processing all the chaos. So it's functional. Great. In adult, as we move on, right, if we get older, become a teenager, become adults, it is important for us to be present in work, in our relationships, etc. And I think fundamentally, disassociation breaks your ability to be present. And as an adult, you need to be present. I'll give you a perfect example, Kevin, right? So we just adopted a dog last Thursday. We named him Milo. And we ended up taking Milo to the emergency vet on Sunday night. We were there for 5 to 6 hours.
Yeah.
We were there until 2 a.m. And I was so overwhelmed and panicked because he couldn't breathe properly. He couldn't get up from the floor. It was scary. I was crying. Paul was crying too and scared. And we had to listen to the vet tell us what were the options. I had to fight my disassociation so hard because I could feel myself disassociating. Because why? Because I felt overwhelmed. So whenever you feel overwhelmed, the body's like, oh, I remember this feeling, right? I remember what I do. I remember this is what helps me. So that's what builds coping patterns, right? And so I realized that I was shutting down. He was talking, and I remember thinking, like, Esther, you are not paying attention. Like, you're shutting down. And I'm like, you have to listen. And I was trying to. So one of the things I kept doing is I kept checking in. Am I hearing this correctly? So if I missed something, the doctor had the opportunity to re-say what he was saying. And I know Paul shut down too, because there were things that he was like, oh, the doctor didn't tell us this. And I was like, no, babe, he did. But I think you were so overwhelmed that you tuned him out. And so that's a perfect example, Kevin, that like, if you're taking your dog, your child to get medical services, you can't shut down. You need to listen to those, or you shouldn't, right? You shouldn't shut down because you need to listen to those instructions. Like their doctor's telling you, like, you need to do X, Y, Z. So that's kind of like a trivial example, but you know, we're surrounded by these all the time. If you're in a car accident and you start disassociating, how are you going to remember details, right? How are you going to ask for the right information so that you can give it to your insurance? So ideally, we should learn how to stay calm and self-regulated so that in moments of emergencies, we can be present and we can, you know, navigate those situations as they need to be navigated.
Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this break. You're listening to the Leo Podcast. I'm Kevin Munoz. Support for today's episode comes from my Patreons. If you enjoy the show and are looking for bonus content and to further support the show, then head on over to patreon.com/latinamericaneo or visit my website latinamericaneo.org to join the growing Leo podcast community. Because the learning doesn't stop with this episode. There's also some sick merch on my website, everything from shirts, coffee mugs, and tote bags. All info will be at the bottom in the show notes. Now let's get back to today's episode. Yeah, how do you find like a healthy balance with that? Like, how do you fight off like dissociation? Is it a matter of like knowing that you're about to shut down and then kind of saying like, no, I need to be present for this, or like what's
I can't really speak to this because that is way outside of my area of expertise, and I don't want to come off and be like, this is what you do, because I'm a sociologist.
What do you do? Like, what have you done to be more present? To like, what have you actively done in your life to try and be more present, right?
So I can send you some Instagram handles that you should follow. So one of the things, so first and foremost, and this is true for everyone, first and foremost, understand your triggers. That is very true. Mm-hmm. It is important to take a step back and take an inventory of what your triggers are. So for your sister to know, like, my triggers are wind, blah, 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 right? Because then maybe that way she can anticipate, right? She can come up with a game plan. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So first and foremost, know your triggers. Second, know your coping patterns, whether they are maladaptive or not. So maladaptive coping patterns are things that you do to deal with the stress. However, they're considered maladaptive because long-term, they don't really help you out. They don't really serve you, right? So like shutting down, disassociating. One thing also to note, and we'll eventually get back to this, a very common coping mechanism, maladaptive, within the immigrant community is actually avoidance. So avoidance is found in a lot of trauma survivors, and it's definitely be found in immigrants, undocumented immigrants. So we have been so overwhelmed by certain experiences that later on we avoid things that are stressful. So what that means is we won't call our doctors to make an appointment. We won't answer an email, right? We won't answer a text. So we learn to avoid things to immediately provide a sense of relief. And some of you may be hearing and you're like, oh yeah, that's great. I get to put it off. But the reality is that anxiety just looms, because then like, I have to do it and I haven't. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
So yeah, so understand know your triggers, know your coping patterns. Definitely get in touch with therapy, which I know that's very taboo in the community. Yeah. But CBT, psychoeducation, can really, really help. So if someone is listening and someone is like, you know what, I don't want to go to therapy, I respect it. Don't go to therapy. Read a book by a licensed clinician, not some fool you're listening to on Instagram. Because there's really, Kevin, you don't even know.
Seems like you had some experience in that scenario.
I sometimes try correcting people, but it's so hard. There's people who really, really speak outside of the area of expertise, and it really, really bothers me. Yeah. Because people look to you as a source of credibility, and you're out here spilling garbage that isn't true. Maybe it's true for you, but that doesn't mean it's true for society. But
it could be dangerous too. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're saying the wrong thing and someone goes and maybe takes that to heart, and then maybe they get worse because of it, right? Like maybe that advice is the wrong type of advice, and then it might just make their whole behavior like spiral out of control or something. Like worst case scenario.
There's a financial advisor who I follow. I won't name her. She's Latina, and she's always talking about like, oh, we have to, superarnos, like we have to get up. And she just wrote a post about like how attachment is not good, and we have to let go of attachment, and we shouldn't have expectations, and the goal should be for detachment. And I was thinking, you're so wrong. Human beings are driven for attachment. And the goal in life shouldn't be to detach. Like the issue is that we need to attach ourselves to healthy people. The issue isn't attachment.
Yes.
The issue is
Yeah.
that we attach ourselves to things that don't serve us. That's the problem, you know?
Yeah.
And then she's talking about how like, oh, don't have any expectations. Are you kidding me? But we have expectations. Expectations are part of society and relationships, and they're normal to have. The issue is that so many people have unrealistic expectations.
Yeah.
And so she's going on, and I'm like, homegirl, you are not a social scientist. Stop. You're a financial advisor. Which,
Yeah.
thank you. Tell me how to do my taxes and tell me how to
Tell me
invest.
about the finance. Yeah.
Yeah, but like you were speaking way out of term.
Uh,
Just stuff like that. But one thing for you to keep, for the listeners to keep in mind is there's strategies on how to ground yourself. Drinking water.
mhm,
If you're feeling really stressed out, take a sip of water.
mhm.
Splash cold water on your face. That can bring you back. Right? Do some squats. Plank. I'm being dead serious, right? Lay on the ground. So people are going to respond to different strategies. So learn what works for you. So for some people, movement can get people out of it. It can bring people back into the present.
Mm,
Whenever I teach, I always have water. And part of that is like if someone is stressing me out, one of my students, I can't shut down because I have to give them an answer, right?
yeah.
So taking a drink of water allows my brain to regroup and then come back.
I could picture you just like taking like a drink, like, and then getting back to them, and they're just like,
So I want to buy a sticker that says emotionally supportive water bottle because
Yes.
it's like it is true, right? Like it's my emotional support, and I sometimes I have tea too, and like shit could be hitting the fan. I just need my tea because my tea is what and my water is what's gonna keep me like kumbaya. But there's so many tips, right? Again, like changing the temperature is a very good one. You
Mm,
just have to figure out like what works for you.
right. Yeah. And yeah, that's the other thing too that kind of leads into, like you mentioned earlier, was the I think you said that there was like levels of stress. Like having a little bit of stress is healthy, right? It's good.
Yeah.
But like having too much repeated stress, I think you said, is what leads to like PTSD and anxiety, right? Like what are the, like the level? What's like a healthy amount of stress compared to like non-healthy?
So that I can't give you, but
Yeah.
there is a TED talk that I can find and I can send it to you later on,
Yeah.
and
Was
maybe
that
you
the
can.
one that you sent me on the
No,
Okay, okay.
no, there's another one. So sporadic stress is fine, but the one that is chronic stress, that's the one that's problematic because it's gonna shoot up your cortisol levels, and there's real
Mm,
ramifications from constantly being in a state of stress, right? Um, we know that trauma definitely can impact brain size, brain
yeah.
chemistry. Like there's studies on this. So we know that that's problematic. I can't give you like this recipe, like this formula, like, hey, as long
Yeah.
as you're like only stress one day out of the week.
Yeah, and I feel like that'd be hard to like measure too, because everyone's different. Like this gets stressed by different things, and everyone handles stress differently, right?
And I think that's another component too, is like, how do you handle your stress? Like,
Mm,
because some people can be constantly stressed, but they're better at managing that stress. So there's a lot of moving components to that.
yeah.
But I'll find something and I'll send it to you.
Yeah, no, I would love to read that. Speaking of that TED Talk though, that was from I did look into it, I saw it, and I found it because I found it very like intriguing. It was a TED Talk from pediatrician
Oh,
Nadine Burke
yes.
Harris,
Yeah.
and she was explaining like the repeated stress of abuse and neglect of parents struggling with mental health, even like substance abuse issues, how that has like real tangible effects on the developing brain, right? So she's talking about like kids that are exposed to this and how it unfolds over like a lifetime. One thing I got out of that TED talk was how like you said, it has real effects on like the brain. Where there was like I saw also connected it to another article that you shared where like it compared like an MRI of like two brains, and like one was like a normal brain, and then the other one was like exposed to like extreme, I think it was extreme stress. But you could see like the real difference
Yeah.
in size. And I was like mind blown. I was like, it can literally like shrink our brains to be constantly exposed to this. And another thing she mentioned was like it can lead to like heart disease and like lung cancer. And I was just like, this is insane. Like, why isn't like more work being done to make us aware of this, and like more educate more people, especially like immigrants who are and minorities and people of color who are exposed constantly to this type of environment and stress. Like, why do you think more hasn't been done, or do you think there has been more like over the years?
The only perspective that I have is like the perspective of education,
Yeah.
right? Do I feel like we explore enough trauma-informed practices in education? Absolutely not. No. Do I feel like this is adequately funded? No. Do I feel like there's enough professional development? No. There is such little opportunity, and maybe that's driven by a lack of interest, right? Of how trauma impacts learning, how trauma impacts functioning, because trauma can definitely impact, like, and again, so my whole knowledge is like in the classroom, but in terms of in the classroom, like trauma can impact your sleeping habits, your eating habits. So, sometimes kids are falling asleep in classes and you might be thinking, oh, this kid is lazy. When the reality is that, they just experienced trauma. Some kids are really quick to like instigate fights. I remember one time I had the situation with a student. She was a Latina female. And she like, I push back with my students a lot. Like, why do you think that is? And she would take it really personally. And one day I had to sit with her and I had to be like, it's my job to teach you and it's my job to make you think critically. I'm not attacking you. I'm cultivating a learning environment.
Yeah.
And she came at me hot. And this is not my proudest moment. But I turned to her, I said to her, I said, I don't know who hurt you, but I'm not here to hurt you. And I don't know what you've been through, but this is a safe space. And my intention is not to hurt you. I'm here for you. And she just broke down and she started crying. Wow. And in reality, I shouldn't have made that assumption, right? But to me, it became very clear that this person is in pain, right? And she's not purposely trying to be difficult or mean or rude. Like, you could tell that this person was hurting. And that's why I said, I don't know who hurt you, but I'm not here to hurt you. And that's when she broke down and she was like, this is what I've been through. And her attitude in my class totally changed completely.
Wow.
We did a total 180. Like, she was so respectful, so kind. And so one of the things that I advocate, and this might be going a little bit off topic, but I advocate that professors and teachers allow for healing to occur in the classrooms. And it's so crazy, Kevin, because when I talk about cultivating love in the classrooms and cultivating healing, I get so much pushback, especially from colleges and, college
from the staff. Like, oh, wow. Okay.
Like, love doesn't belong in the classroom. This is a professional setting. I have been told that my research is touchy-feely, which don't even get me started, because I'm like, if I was a man, would you say that to me? Would you say that to my academic work?
And yeah, we'll get on that as well, because I want to learn a lot more about how, because you're doing the work, right? You're doing the work with your workshops and going to colleges and being a professor. So yeah, not to cut you off, but I also want to get into how you approach schools and how you approach your class and your experiences as well.
I advocate. So, I mean, that's a whole conversation for another day, but I call my classrooms bubbles of love. and I tell my students, in bubbles of love, right? Like, it doesn't mean that I'm not going to discipline you. That doesn't, I'm still going to give you consequences, and there's going to be expectations, right? Because forget this whole, like, there's no expectations of the world. And I said, but you're going to be respected. There's going to be flexibility. I'm going to see you as a human being, right? I'm not going to shame you. And so, I approach my classrooms. I really do believe in cultivating bubbles of love. in terms of like this whole idea that like classrooms can be healing spaces. And I even want you to think about, anyone who's listening to the podcast, to like how we can be agents of change for other people. We can absolutely be agents of change. If you, with other people in your relationships, if you're trustworthy, if you're honest, right? If you keep your word, you are allowing for some healing to occur. Because here's the thing. When people have experienced trauma, so often we lose trust in people.
Yeah.
Right?
I agree.
And so if we can show up in our spaces and in our relationships and keep our words, be transparent, be consistent, be loving, that can allow for healing, because it can allow them to repair some trust in others. Now, the thing is too, is that approaching people with love, we may never see the fruits of our labor, but maybe we've planted a seed. And so that's how I approach my students. And I think this is also really important for trauma survivors to be aware of. And I don't think I was really aware of this early on, but like, if you're a trauma survivor, you need to find your agents of change. Yeah. You need to find people who are trustworthy, who don't manipulate you, who don't shame you, who are, flexible and adaptable. And like you said something earlier, Kevin, and I don't want to interrupt you, but you were like, oh, what's the difference between like a healthy argument and an unhealthy argument? Are you being respected, right? Is someone actually listening to you? Is someone name calling you? But I can guarantee that if someone's name calling you, if someone is minimizing you, then that's not healthy. But if you're having an argument with someone and you're not name calling, you're really pausing to listen and then countering, that's healthy conflict, right? Yeah. If you can maintain that attachment of, you know what, Kevin, I'm mad at you, but let me tell you this, and you listen to me, and then you counter like, well, Esther, I think you're wrong, and this is why. That's healthy. Yeah. But when we get to like, the yelling and the cursing and the name calling and the belittling and the gaslighting, then that's unhealthy.
No, I agree. It's about, I think, primarily like listening to the other person, right? And then engaging in that conversation. So you're very big on like the whole love aspect, right? And yeah. I even noticed, yeah, I could tell, and I even noticed that you teach what you call, is it the theory of love? Tell us a little bit about that.
Oh man, so this is not my own work at all. So the critical theory of love that I talk about is by Brooks. He's a scholar out in the East Coast. He talks about how love should be adopted in university level campuses, right? Because in college campuses and in schools, you have people who are marginalized and are trauma survivors, which is 100% true, right? 100% true. You have people who are gay, lesbian, trans, right? Homeless, foster youth. You have undocumented students who experience a lot of trauma in their lifetime, typically. You have kids of military vets. You have military vets, all kinds of stuff. So he basically says, listen, in our college campuses, we have trauma survivors. We have people who have been marginalized, right? People who have been oppressed. And so if we want them to do well, we need to follow these 6 pillars, right? And I forget what the 6 pillars are. This is always like, I need my little like cheat sheet.
Yeah.
But it's like seeing people for like, seeing people for as whole people, as people who have resources, which is super important. If you want to really love others, you have to realize that you are not their knight in shining armor. People can save themselves, right? Yeah. You're there to support. You're not there to, this isn't about you. And so he talks about like seeing people as whole. He talks about attending to people's basic needs. So like on college camp, so like for undocumented students, I think about this all the time. Like for college campuses, it's like colleges need to, colleges need to do a better job with dealing with their undocumented student populations. Like, yeah, give them degrees, cool, but teach them, how do you get a job sin papeles, right?
Yeah.
Like how do you do all of these things, hook them up with like legal aid. So this critical theory of love is really about moving beyond teaching them, but also making sure that you really take inventory of what their needs are, and that you maybe take a step back and you shut up and you let people who have been marginalized take the mic, right?
Mm.
It's really about transferring power back to them. So yeah, I talk about his work. There's a couple of things that I kind of like twist and adapt to particular populations, especially with undocumented students. But it's just really this idea of like, you're actually really helping and you're
Yeah.
really understanding people and what they need from you.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree that I feel like more if that was the case, like more love was applied into like college campuses, like even just like done, um, like the work was done with love for undocumented students. Like instead of just saying like we're doing this for undocumented students, but not having people like going to like tell undocumented students how to do the work, like how you can apply for like financial aid, or like, hey, look, we have these scholarships, instead of like us having to go to the like office and being like, when you're at your breaking point at that end, like when you're like, I can't fund the college, like is there any options for me, like, or I'm gonna have to like drop out. And she's like, oh, actually you can do this. And it's just like, wow, like maybe I didn't have to go through this whole like traumatic experience. And I saw you like a little bit like hesitant in saying like why like colleges need to be better at that. Is there like a particular reason?
I don't want to like, like crap talk my institutions, but it's true. I
Okay,
think people
okay.
people forget like I'm an educator, but like, oh yeah, there's so many flaws in the college system.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important, like if you're a cop, cool, understand that there's flaws in law enforcement,
Yeah.
like be a doctor, cool, there's problems in medical care.
Yeah.
And so as an educator, I'm like, dude, we're so messed up, like we could be doing things so much better. But institutions are hard to change
Yeah.
sometimes. I think one of the things that I really wish, one of the things that I want to bring to my campus, so
Mm.
besides teaching, sometimes I work on these like proposals, like, oh yeah, let me get this person on campus. And actually, Kevin, I might reach out to
Oh,
you.
okay.
But one of the things that I would love to do on campus is I want to run like a series or like a workshop
Yeah.
where for undocumented students that can teach them how to create businesses without being a citizen or a resident.
Oh, that'd
So
be awesome.
essentially like how to be entrepreneurs, because it is true that sometimes undocumented students, they're going to get their degrees, but based on what's happening, they may not end up having a career in their degree,
Yeah.
because if someone doesn't have papers, right, how do you end up in certain institutions?
Mm-hmm.
And so, that's a conversation that I've had to have with some of my undocumented students. And I said, like, make it work. Like, what else could you do until something changes? And I don't know if you follow like any undocumented like IG influencers, I guess.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, but like Sizzle, like the DJ out in here in LA. Like
Oh,
she's a
okay.
baddie. Or I don't know if you Este Yossi Day.
Okay.
He's a poet, and he goes on campuses and he recites like his poetry, and he gets money for it.
Yeah, you can do those things. Yeah, I know people. I have my friend for Vicky from a Shot of Truth podcast. Actually, she goes. She also does like workshops on the undocumented like experience for colleges, and even like other things she does as well. But like that's something that, and she gets paid for that. Like that's awesome. Like there's things that we can do, but we just have to do them in like a different way. And like even starting your own business, like as if you have your like ITIN number and investing and all that type of stuff, like we can do it too, but just have to take like different roads. What are like some things that you typically see like in your classroom from like undocumented kids, when it comes to how they behave and like learn in like in college environment, right?
I can't answer that question for you, Kevin,
Yeah.
and this is why. A lot of my students don't tell me that they're undocumented.
Right. Okay. Makes
And
sense. Yeah.
and so I don't know. And it's really interesting because so this is something that I know, this is within my area of expertise. I can talk about coming out. So coming out is a process of you disclosing something that is deeply secretive and intimate about yourself, right? So
Yeah.
most typically when we think about coming out, we think about people who are gay or lesbian, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is that there's also an undocumented closet,
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
right?
It was tough for me just to start like the podcast and like speaking out because everything that comes with that, right?
Right. And so like there is also this undocumented closet that undocumented individuals and students, are in. And again, this is not necessarily good or bad, it just is. And so I'll have a couple of students who tell me that they're undocumented. But I think most of them don't come out to me, and that's okay. I so one of the things that I talk about in my workshop is do not expect your undocumented students or anyone, whether they're foster youth or whether there's someone who has mental health disorders, to come out to you, because not everyone will come out. And it actually has nothing to do with you, because some professors and counselors take it personal, like, why don't they come out? They can trust me. It's not about you. It's about their
Yeah.
past experience, right? You're
Yeah,
laughing,
you're
Kevin,
right.
but it's true.
Yeah, I'm
It's
laughing
like,
because it's true. Like, yeah, it's not about you. Like,
it's not. And it's like sometimes they don't trust the setting. Sometimes they don't trust their
yeah.
classmates. Sometimes they don't trust, like they've had really negative past experiences. I've had students that I've interviewed who are like, yeah, coming out was not easy. Then they started joking. My own friends started making fun of me and making comments that made me feel insecure.
Mm-hmm.
So I tell, and I preach this in my classrooms. I'm like, you don't have to tell me anything. Like, I'm going to be here for you, right? Like, you tell me what you feel comfortable with. So coming out, there's four stages in coming out. And I don't want to bore you because then it's going to sound like a lecture, right?
No,
But
well, you can like
sometimes,
name them. You can
oh,
name like
sure.
yeah,
So
that'd be interesting.
there's passing, covering, implicitly out, and explicitly out. And I'll
Okay.
quickly talk about that.
Yeah, yeah.
So when people pass, it's essentially like pretending. So when people are passing, they're giving off the image that they are documented, that they are
Gotcha.
citizens or they're residents, right?
Oh yeah, I've done that. A lot of us do
Yes.
that for just reasons that makes it feel safer and then more normal around our environment. Like,
And so coming out, by the way, is typically the product of a risk benefit analysis. And people tend to come out when it feels like it's going to favor them. So that's passing, right? It's like pretending. Then we have covering. And covering is when people omit, they keep out the information that would let others know that they're undocumented. So they're honest, right? They're not pretending, but anything that has to deal with being undocumented, they keep that information out. So maybe they don't tell their friends that they were born in a different country. Does that make sense?
Yep, yep.
So you're not lying, you're just keeping information out.
Yeah,
right?
I would never tell like I wouldn't tell people, and I'm speaking from like my experience. I'm sure there's like a lot of similar experiences, right? Like I wouldn't tell people that I was like born in Guatemala unless I was like asked because of what came with that. It's like, oh, what? You were born in Guatemala? Like, oh, you know Spanish then? Like, oh, what was it like? Well, how'd you come here? Like, it just opens a whole can of worms.
Yes. And that can and that can be re-traumatizing. Like telling your story again and again, that could be a source of stress or a source of trauma or both. And then the other type of coming out, and this is the one that I tell professors and counselors to be the most careful with. Some people are telling us who they are. So the next step in the coming out process, and by the way, this is not linear and people can be all over the place. Like you can be out in one setting and passing in another one. Maybe because one setting you're safe and the other one you're not. So it's not like, you're leveling up like a Nintendo game. Like you can be all over this line, right? And so sometimes students are implicitly out. And I'll give you an example of this. So implicitly out is when people are honest about their lives and the details about their lives, but they don't use labels. So I'll give you an example. Last week, one of my students, who I'll call Albert, He's a very sweet kid, very much likes me. Whenever he's walking by and he sees me, and even if he's not in my class, he always waves to me, even if I'm teaching my other class. So I look ridiculous because I'll be like teaching and I'm like waving to a kid in the distance, like, hey, what's up? And Albert, very sweet. He was telling me that he's in this like student success program where like counselors help them individually. And I was like, oh, how do you like it? And he said, oh, I like it. He's like, I wasn't born here. And he really helps me understand my options.
Mm.
What are you thinking, Kevin?
He's trying to get help. Like he's coming out, like telling you that he's like undocumented, right?
But he's coming out, but he's not telling us explicitly.
Yeah, like indirectly, like telling you, like just throwing it out there, like to see as a feeler.
Yeah, and so I don't know about the whole feeler stuff, but that's someone who's implicitly out. They're honest, but they're just avoiding the labels. And so one of the things I told teachers and for people who are listening, you listen to me. Sometimes people are telling us who they are. They're just not telling us in a way that we understand. So it's our job to listen to people and to kind of read a little bit in between the lines and maybe clarify or not, like, am I correct in this? Now, I'm not going to ask my student if he's undocumented or not, right? That's not going to happen. But anyway, going back to your question, like, do I see a difference in their learning? I wouldn't know how to answer because a lot of my students don't tell me that they're undocumented, right? But I will say this, in my undocumented students, I see a lot of stress, a lot. And it breaks my heart. I see a lot of everything. Obviously, I see a lot of joy and a lot of resiliency, and I don't want to take away from that. But I see a lot of loss of faith. I see a lot of like desperation. I see hopelessness too. I have a student who's undocumented, and she doesn't qualify for DACA. And she has her bachelor's degree in sociology, went to the same university I did, and she works at Carl's Jr. And she feels so defeated. And I love her so much. I still keep in touch with her. And I see a lot of that. I see a lot. And it's normal. Like this idea that it's like, oh, you're always going to be like bright and cheery and look in the bright side. No, people are allowed to feel like this is messed up and this is unfair. And so I see a lot of that. I see a lot of, I see obviously gratitude too. Like, oh, at least I see everything under the spectrum, but there's also a lot of stress. And you know this, Kevin, right? There's a lot of stress.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's also why I ask, because, you see this every day, and that's a lot of something that I didn't realize till like after high school, and I got more comfortable in college, was handling that stress and how it impacted my ability to learn, while I had like constant fear of just being deported and everything that comes with that, and also trying to help my family, and also trying to pursue higher education. Like it's tough, and it's something that I've had to come to terms with, and like learn to de-stress, and how learning a lot about ourselves is definitely what we have to do, is invest a lot into learning a lot about ourselves. But yeah, no, I appreciate you coming on the podcast. And if there's any like topic that I didn't touch up on that you want to bring up as well, or if you want to speak up a little bit about more about what you do, like your workshops, and where people can get in touch with you, this is your time.
I forgot about that. Yeah. But first and foremost, like, I just want to, let people know that it's like, it's okay if you have trauma. It's okay if you're a trauma survivor, like you don't have to be defined by your trauma, and people are not. And just remember that there's help out there, like cognitive behavior therapy is really helpful, psychoeducation. So if you're not ready to go to therapy, again, like find a book, find a reputable person that can, teach you coping skills, right? If you're not ready to talk about it, or you find something, right? Some of it sometimes can be like trial and error.
Yeah.
First and foremost, I would say, like, don't invalidate your experiences. I feel like we have so much invalidation and sometimes toxic positivity, like, oh, but it could be worse. Just because
Mm.
something can be worse doesn't mean that it's not bad. And so just be really careful with how you talk to yourself. Be really careful with the people that you surround yourself with. If you can, be an agent of change for other people, whether those are students that you work with or coworkers, but just surround yourself with that too. Um, Trauma absolutely has real ramifications on learning, right? Like, what you were talking about, Kevin.
Yeah,
When we've experienced trauma, we can be very distracted because our brains are thinking about other stuff, right? It's like ruminating on things.
exactly.
And even students who have DACA or people who have DACA, their stress isn't done because maybe they won't get deported, but maybe their family will, right? So, you know, this stress is real and there's ways that you can adapt and there's things that you can do for yourself so that you can stay afloat. It's just about finding something that works for you and making sure that you have the support that you need. Going back, so my name is Esther Villegas-Sandoval, a sociologist, researcher. I talk a lot about trauma-informed practices. A lot of my research has focused on understanding undocumented student experiences, particularly in California, because that's where I'm from and that's the access that of students that I've had with. But sure, if anyone wants to reach me, you can email me at mindfulsociologist@gmail.com. I had an Instagram account going for a while and then I just stopped because I myself was overwhelmed. So understanding my own boundaries, I just took a step back because, COVID has been really challenging, I think, for a lot of us. And I needed to show up a little bit extra for my students right now. And I just needed to keep all of my extra hobbies kind of on the down low.
Mm-hmm.
But I have an IG account, Mindful Sociologist. I hope to restart it soon, maybe in the summer. But yeah, if anyone wants to have me on or book me for a gig, because the extra money is helpful, so I can keep rescuing dogs and taking them to the vet hospital and having $1,200 bills.
Oh my God. Yeah, no, absolutely. Follow her and hit her up as well for the workshops. I mean, you shared a little bit about like the wealth of knowledge that you have with us, and I appreciate you doing that for us. Yeah, it's kind of funny. I saw touching up on the adopting dogs and stuff. I think I saw that you did you have a cat in your backyard
Oh my
that you
God,
also had to take in? Like,
So
I
I
was
think
like, you went through like getting the mother cat, and I saw that she had like kittens or something. Like, what was the whole like?
so I had kittens born in my backyard with a mom,
Okay,
and
that's what I thought.
I thought mom wasn't around, but she was. But then I kept feeding them because I was worried about them. And then, so for a few weeks, I was keeping an eye on them, making sure they were growing. And then recently, I had to trap all of them so that I can get them. So I had to find a foster mom for them. Right now, I'm finding cat moms. So I'm telling my students, and it's so funny you say that, Kevin, because today I got a message. Do you know anyone who wants a pug? So now I'm trying to find this pug a home.
Yeah.
So I love animals. I really do. And so I think my positive trauma response is to help. And I think that's what's helped me, I think, get through life is feeling like I have a purpose and feeling like my purpose is to make sunshine in people or in animals' lives. So just so you know, Kevin, yes, the kittens are being rehomed. I need to trap mom to get her fixed so she can not have kittens anymore, and so she can be like live her best life. But Milo has kept me busy because he's right here like panting. So right now I'm giving him antibiotics, and so that's my life. So apparently I'm like a pet mom.
Yeah, I was so invested. I'm like, wait, she found like a cat mom. Wait, she had babies? Like,
it was the most. Yeah.
Oh my God.
So yeah. So
oh my gosh. Whoa.
So I'm over here trying to save like, one student at a time and one animal at a time. But
you're bringing sunshine in everybody's life, and especially in ours today. So thank you.
Thank you. Although the universe can chill with the animals for a while, it's very. I'm over here like buying random cats food, like learning to pet code, like googling how do you treat kittens?
Yeah. Oh my god.
So how it works.
I love some of those stories. So.
Well, I'll keep you an update there.
Yeah, keep us updated. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it with a family or a friend and rate it 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It helps tremendously in order to bring more awareness and educational resources to our community. For more information and to stay up to date with what I'm doing, you can follow me on Instagram at LatinaAmericaneo. And if you need more information and resources, you can visit my website, latinaamericaneo.org. I'm Kevin Munoz. This has been the Leo Podcast, and I'll see you next time.